Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll discuss reducing noise distractions and achieving speech privacy in the modern workplace. I'm Ann Cosgrove, the editor-in-chief of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar today is presented by Cambridge Sound Management. Before we get started, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items with you. Please note the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions via the question box contained in that panel. You can send your questions in at any time, and your speaker will address them either during or after the presentation. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of your control panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the control panel, so please be sure it is expanded so you can access the question box. You can also use that question space if you experience a technical difficulty at any time or have any other type of question. You can send us a message there and someone will address you behind the scenes there. So now I'd like to introduce your speaker today, Balazs Baldag. Balazs has been with Cambridge Sound Management for 6 years, during which time he has held positions from inside sales to field sales engineer, to most recently he is the Northeast Regional Manager for the company. He has seen the company grow from 10 employees to approximately 70, and he has personally installed a few thousand emitters while working with installers. So before we begin, we would like to pose a poll question to you out in the audience so we can get a sense of who we're speaking to today. So are you familiar with sound masking? A simple yes or no. Please let us know if you are familiar with the concept, and we will show the results when the polling is complete. Just take a moment to cast your vote there, and that will pop up momentarily. So let's see. Yes, 66% of our audience today has some familiarity with sound masking. So thank you very much for participating in that. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Balazs, and he'll kick off his presentation. Hi, Balazs.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ann. I really appreciate it. Can you guys hear me okay? I had some fun mic issues here just before, so.
Yes, you sound just great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ann. So it seems like about 1/3 of you perhaps has not had any experience with sound masking, while the other 2/3 have. So this will be a really great introduction into sound masking and what it does for us and what it can do for you in your modern type of facility. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So some of the things that we're going to cover in today's webinar, and actually before I get too much further, I'd also like to add, should you think of any questions along the way, sometimes we'd like to hold them for the end, sometimes I'd prefer it. Actually, I usually prefer it if you share those questions right when you think of them. It makes for a more exciting webinar, I guess, and allows you to get involved in it as well. So with that being said, by all means, please let us know if you have any questions. We'll try to get to it as they pop up. Otherwise, we'll answer all of the questions then at the end if we didn't have time during the presentation. So some of the learning objectives that we are going to cover during this webinar are going to be acoustic privacy. So why it's important to the workplace, why does it help us and our employees function better? The ABCs of acoustics, so some of the principles that we use when we build facilities with proper acoustics in mind. And then speech privacy, what exactly it is, how it's measured, and how on earth does it affect my workplace? And then, of course, what would a sound masking presentation be without sound masking? So understanding what role sound masking can play in this facility. And then we'll also cover some design issues lightly. So some of the major things that you can do while you're building out your space to make sure that you're getting the best that you can out of it, acoustically speaking. So acoustic privacy, and I absolutely love this slide because it really drives home the point of what a lot of facilities are looking like today. I'd like to call out in particular this boardroom or conference room surrounded by glass. I'm sure it's very well kitted out with very modern amenities, teleconferencing, and what have you, but almost certainly just about all of those potentially sensitive conversations leak out past the other side of that glass. It's a pretty good chance that I can actually get a finger at the least through those panes of glass, and you can bet that those conversations also carry out into that what looks to be a reception area where just about anyone off of, the street or coming in for an interview or whatever you might have can sit there and listen to the most sensitive of your conversations. I just wanted to call that out because it's one thing that I tend to run into on just about, if not every site visit, the majority of them that I run into. So I have to read this verbatim because I have not yet taken the time to memorize it. Don't think I will, but here it goes. I currently work in a cubicle. My neighbors are a man in the midst of a divorce, a woman with a problem child, another woman with an elderly parent who should be in a care facility. The only cure for my personal hell would be a quiet room with a door. Perhaps my employer would then get his money's worth from my workday. Did I mention that I'm across from the copier? So, quote, that comes to us from GSA and a survey that they did. But it seems, although it sounds a little far-fetched, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to at least some of those issues that they've mentioned there. So, this graph that you're now seeing pop up is a survey, and it basically took employees in different aspects of their workplace, ranging from, maintenance, office layout, just the furnishings, the thermal comfort, so is it too cold, too hot, air quality, and lighting. And it goes from extremely dissatisfied to extremely satisfied. So the more people that you basically have on that diagram, the better off you are. So the one that I like to personally pick on is thermal comfort. So that is much closer to the extremely dissatisfied side of things. I just have to think about, like, my wife and I, for example, if we're watching a movie, she will usually have a sweater on, some sort of fuzzy pants, socks, and what have you, all of the above, and I'll be in a t-shirt. She'll be cold and I will still be sweating. So it's just one of those things. It's really hard to agree on. But if we jump just one more slide over, you see that acoustic privacy scores even lower than that thermal comfort. So one thing that we're finding that workplaces have in common with each other is that acoustic privacy regularly is at the bottom of this score. So employees are really upset about it, and it does make a big difference in terms of how effective they can be throughout the door, how productive they are, and all sorts of other things. So the case for acoustic privacy is also something that can be summed up a little bit better here in numbers. So out of almost 30,000 respondents, 54% of workers felt that they were actually individual workers, right? So that although we push this idea of the open office is meant for more collaboration, which sure it can be, but usually the employees found in these spaces, the majority of them tend to be individual workers. So the respondents of this survey, 46% said that they were actually collaborating. However, they spent 61% of their time actually doing collaborative type of work, whereas 54% of those individual workers actually spent the vast majority of their time, 80%, doing individual work. So what a quick takeaway from just this right here is people need to have their own space in which they can get things done. Although we're not always able to give them physically that space, acoustically it can get much closer to that. They will reward you with much more productivity, increases in not only performance, but you're going to cut down on a lot of their distractions. So some industry concerns as it relates to very specific industry type issues. The first one, and very noticeable, is going to be HIPAA. Now, HIPAA came out with the survey, HCAPS, that inpatients will fill out when they leave a hospital. And this actually made it something more tangible, because previously with HIPAA came along and all HIPAA said was to a hospital or a healthcare facility, are you taking reasonable safeguards to protect patient privacy? And that usually wasn't an issue until someone decided to sue them for whatever reason. And HCAPS came along, and now they tied it back to government funding. So as soon as that happened, we saw a lot more attention being paid to it. ASTM, the American Standards for Testing and Measurements, and then of course LEED certification as well. These are all things that sound masking can help out with. So the ABCs of acoustics. These are going to be those three elements that will help you build an acoustically sound workspace. So our A is for absorption. Anything like your acoustical ceiling tile, wall panels, those can all be absorption, and will help out significantly with basically the overall sound pressures of a given workspace. Carpeting helps a lot as well, especially if you're able to get something a little bit on the fuzzier, thicker side of things. Usually it doesn't happen, but then carpeting can certainly become a very effective means of absorption. B is blocking. This one's fairly evident. Your walls, your doors, cubicle partitions, anything like that. So if there's an ability to sort of raise up those cubicle partitions, then that certainly makes for a more effective space. In terms of acoustic privacy, it's usually not the prettiest looking solution, and it's extremely rare to find an office that actually has relatively high partitions these days. More often than not, we're seeing them disappear altogether. If not, maybe you'll end up with that 6-inch piece of glass that separates you from a coworker, and just about the only thing it does is keep your pen from rolling from your side of the desk to theirs. So acoustically, it's not going to do anything. Then the C in this equation is coverage. So that can be a number of things. It can be traffic noise. It can be an HVAC system. It can be a fountain. Fountain's actually a fairly effective one, as we'll find out a little bit later on. And then, of course, sound masking. So sound masking is also acting on that C of this equation. So next we'll go over some of the furniture and construction trends. Now here they're still called out as trends. It's not even so much of a trend anymore. It's just been what has been happening since probably the late 80s, early 90s, and ever since then. So we're dealing with more and more open plan areas, obviously. And within those open office areas, a lot has been changing as well. So the partitions are actively getting lower and lower. I could see that just in the last few years when we moved our offices just across the hall. And we went from like a 5-foot high partition to a 4-foot partition. And that happened over the span of just a couple of years. Denser, smaller cubicles, we noted that same thing. The cubicles got a little bit smaller. I think they went from like a 10 by 8 to like an 8 by 8 in certain areas. And then, of course, the use of more reflective surfaces. Architects love reflective surfaces. If it's shiny and hard and usually acoustically a very poor substance, then they love using it just about everywhere. I think glass. Glass seems to be everywhere now, and they certainly love using more and more glass. So we call them enclosed areas, and we don't call them private offices now for a very specific reason. You're looking at a lot more demountable walls used instead of actual physical walls, stationary walls. Another trend that has been, increasingly popular is the walls just are not going up all the way to the deck. If you're working on a new build out and you have influence in bringing your walls up all the way to the deck, at that point, it's still a relatively easy fix, and it shouldn't be too much in terms of budget or add too much to that build out, but it will make a significant difference in the way that the space sounds, or more importantly, doesn't sound. Increased use of glass. Glass is great, lets in obviously a lot more light, gives a feeling of openness and what have you, but it's also usually a very terrible acoustic isolation. If you're using glass somewhere, then at the very least be sure to seal any of the gaps that you've got in between the glass panes. That'll actually go really far in cutting down some of that sound transfer. So speech privacy. What exactly is speech privacy, and how do we measure it? So speech privacy, this is a really important takeaway, all right? So pay attention to this one. So speech privacy is the inability of an unintentional listener to understand another person's conversation. This is important because it's often kind of confused with other things. So I've been into so many presentations or where someone had any questions about a sound masking system, and they would go to me and be like, well, look, Balaj, I can still hear that person talking. I'm like, yeah, you can hear them. And keep in mind, we'd be like 60 feet away. I'm like, okay, you can hear them, but what are they saying? Oh, I don't know. So we'd move a little closer. We'd move a little closer. Same answer would usually come out of it. Well, I can't quite tell, but you can pick out a few words here and there. So by the time he realized it, we were up to about 12 or 10 feet away from these people that were having the conversation until you could actually intelligibly tell what was being said. Now, that's where the problem begins. It's not an issue if you can hear sort of murmured speech or muffled speech. Our brains don't pick up on that. As soon as you can pick out things that are important to you, right? Or if they're talking about like a baseball game or you hear your name, something like that, that's when you become distracted. Not only during that conversation, but also after it's been finished, it'll take you some time to reacclimate to whatever it was that you were working on before. So speech privacy, kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but speech privacy is the inability of an unintentional listener to understand another person's conversation. The key there is understand. You can hear certain words, but can you understand what they're talking about? So speech privacy complaints are really due to distractions caused by overheard conversations. This perceived level of distraction is directly related to the intelligibility of the overheard conversation, like we alluded to before. And it becomes a signal to noise ratio when you think about it. So it really just depends on how loud and clear, really, that overheard speech is compared to the loudness of any background noises. And a background noise, keep in mind, doesn't have to be sound masking. It can be a number of different things, traffic, the fountain, whatever it might be. So how private actually is my conversation? And here, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's just something I want you to be aware of. So on this, on the privacy index, the speech privacy index, zero privacy is basically when you can hear every single thing that's going on. Where we aim to actually be with sound masking is going to be in 80 to about 95%, the percentile. Minimum privacy starts to pop up around 60 to 80%. We aim to be here, 80 to 95%. Now, the vast majority of open office spaces don't even come close to this. We've seen several reports by acoustical consulting firms and what have you. If you can get even to 80 in an open office environment, then you have certainly done your homework. You've done a wonderful job of building out this space with quality materials and a good layout. Now, we aim to be at 95% or over for any type of confidential spaces for such as private offices. Obviously, this doesn't even come close to the type of results you'd expect from, say, a SCIF or any government areas. So again, that was just kind of it quickly. Next is the speech privacy potential. This is a really neat and kind of an easy way to more or less tangibly understand these different ratings. So it's a rating system used by the GSA to determine speech privacy. And basically, all you're doing is you're taking the noise isolation class of the actual space, and then background noise, which again can be just about anything. So how loud the background sound is versus whatever type of materials you're using in this space. When you add those two numbers together, all right, so when you look at a ceiling tile, a door, they're all going to have these numbers here, the noise criterion. And you add those numbers together, and that's where you end up on this list right here. So you take those, you add them together, and hopefully you will be high up on that list. So at a 90, shouting is barely audible. Again, kind of a rarity these days. And as you work your way down, you can kind of see that. Say at a good, you're probably looking at normal voices are audible, but mostly unintelligible. Raised voices become somewhat unintelligible. So it's just a nice way to and tangibly kind of understand what those numbers actually mean. So defining a goal, and this is really what we're doing with sound masking. You see Mr. Blue Man in this circle of sadness, I guess. I just came out with that one. Let me know what you thought about that. But anyways, so the circle of sadness is really the radius of distraction. So it's all of the office conversations that this person is now overhearing. And this is really important because for certain people, myself included, so when I was, and I am in our Woburn or our Waltham office, I'm clearly able to hear conversations from 60, 70 feet away, clearly hear those conversations. What we do when we add sound masking to that same space, and what I tried to mention before with how far I can hear those conversations was really just that my radius of distraction is actually much bigger than what Blue Man here is hearing. But here's what we do with sound masking. So we're able to take this space where he or she's overhearing all of these conversations from, and we can make it so that Blue Man here or woman is only hearing people and understanding. Remember intelligibility? Intelligibly understanding the people sitting within about 10 or 12 feet of him or her. So essentially what you're doing with adding sound masking is, at least acoustically speaking, you're adding 3 to 4 times the actual space that an employee has to themselves acoustically. Kind of one way to think about it, I suppose. So sound masking, what exactly is sound masking and what does this stuff actually sound like? So sound masking is the process of adding a sound masking is the process of adding a low-level background sound to an environment to promote speech privacy and freedom from distraction. Now, I must mention that this low-level background sound is an engineered spectrum of sound, and the very frequencies that are built into this sound are those frequencies found within speech. So by injecting this sound at a very low level, we're able to basically just pull up the noise floor of the space. And by doing this, we greatly enhance speech privacy. So ideally, the background sound level, it shouldn't be too low, and it shouldn't be too loud. If it's too loud, it's going to become kind of a nuisance in itself. However, if it's too quiet, it won't be as effective as it can be. And we'll get into what those SPL ratings are, sound pressure levels are for an appropriate space. Also, something though that's noteworthy that I don't have any slides about is overseas, our colleagues in Europe, actually, they use sound masking, not quite like we do, but they will actually take their systems and they will run them even quieter than we run them here stateside. Now, whether that's due to more advanced HVAC systems that just run quieter, or if it's a cultural thing and they don't tend to be as loud in the grand scheme of things, we're not quite certain. But bottom line is they do effectively run sound masking systems just a good deal quieter than what we do. So I think that this is actually a quote you can find on Wikipedia, and I believe that our owner, Jack Hine, our former owner, Jack Hine, put it up there. And it's believed that one of the earliest examples of sound masking is the Romans' use of water fountains to mask the sound of chariots on cobblestone streets. You're welcome to fly over to Rome and to play with that example and to try and prove it wrong. I'm sure it would be a fun experiment. And then actually, interesting to note is that sound masking, sometimes when I mention sound masking, either you know or you don't know. And as the poll showed earlier today, about 2/3 of you are familiar with sound masking to some degree. Now, it's actually been around since the 1950s and 1960s, when Bolt, Brennick, and Newman were asked by the United Nations to come up with an electronic means of basically masking conversations around the United Nations. This company later formed a spin-off called Acoustics, which is a world-renowned acoustical consulting firm. And Acoustics spun off and formed none other than Cambridge Sound Management. So interestingly enough, we are a direct descendant of the original pioneers of sound masking. So some key elements to an effective sound masking system. So the first one's going to be the sound spectrum. And we're going to cover all of these in, I believe, a bit more detail here later. So the sound spectrum is the actual color of the sound, if you will. It's that set of frequencies that I mentioned before that's meant to target speech. It's not just a white noise, pink noise, brown noise, whatever you want to call it. It's a very targeted set of frequencies at a certain level that covers up speech. Next one's going to be the overall sound level. Depending on what kind of space we're dealing with, whether it's open office, private office, or enclosed offices, I should say, perhaps a corridor, conference rooms, what is the appropriate sound level for those types of spaces? Proper zoning is also extremely important. With proper zoning, it allows us to set the right sound pressure levels, also allows us to add music or paging into these areas if we want to, and then of course setting the volumes appropriately for those different types of spaces. And then uniformity, absolutely vital and probably the most critical of all features of a sound masking system is going to be uniformity. You can't have any fluctuation in the sound level throughout the space. When I say any, I mean about 3 decibels, okay, in fluctuation, plus or minus 1.5 dBA is ideal. With that kind of uniformity, you walk across the space and sound masking is just a part of the space. It's there and it's effective, and no one notices it's there until for some reason the system's unplugged or you have a power outage and it goes out, and what you notice is all of a sudden you're overhearing conversations from 70 feet away and you're able to understand them perfectly clear, whereas before you were not. So uniformity is very, very important. So although I kind of alluded on these before, here you'll get a better idea of what it was that I was talking about. So if you look at white noise, you're basically seeing an increasing set of frequencies as you make your way across the range here. If you've heard pure white noise, it's pretty obnoxious. It's just a very annoying sound. That blue set there is one of our frequencies that we use in one of the, I believe it's the QT standard system. So what we do there is we take what we believe to be optimum to mask speech, and we build that into our units that then push out this set of frequencies into the space. And actually, what I forgot to mention before was that this is actually one of the few things that manufacturers in the sound masking world actually agree on, is where those frequencies need to be in order to be effective. So the level of sound. Now this is going to be interesting, although I alluded to this before too. It comes as a surprise to most people. So if you think about a quiet library, you're getting about 30 or so dBA in sound pressure. We use an A-weighted scale. It's more applicable for office type environments. It gets rid of a lot of the frequencies that we don't deal with in a non-office type of an atmosphere. So anyways, your typical office conversation is about 60 or so dBA. A vacuum cleaner, around 70 dBA. That would be a pretty good vacuum cleaner though. 85 dBA, and trust me, this has been proven over and over by my colleagues and our field sales engineers. There's nothing like seeing a group of acousticians or audio people sitting on a plane, and they've all got their iPads or their spectrum analyzers out, and you're seeing all of these different graphs moving up and down. A weird bunch, a fun, but a weird bunch. Anyway. And then you move into a power drill. It's like a hammer drill, really, which is really hurting your eardrums at 98 dBA or so. Now, if I would ask most of you, where do you think sound masking sits in here? The majority of you, at least based on my experience, would say, well, it should be around that 60 or so dBA, right? You would think that to cover up an office conversation, you'd need to have that same amount of SPL. Not the case. To do so, you would actually want to be at about 47 or so dBA. Now, the reason for that is, keep in mind, we're not going to be able to cover up the conversations with the person that you yourself are talking to, nor would we want to. You can't cover up a face-to-face conversation because Well, we could, but it would have to be obnoxiously loud. Certainly not something you want to do. And then these readings are going to be a bit different for private offices and other areas. And actually in those situations, it's going to be quieter than that. Overseas, like I'd mentioned before, a lot of times they have their systems somewhere just over 30. And although it works, it's not going to be as effective as we have here stateside. So another element that
Balazs,
yes.
I'm sorry to break in, but it's Anne. I wanted to ask a question actually, based on those varying decibels and situations that you had just been showing.
Yes.
And the question is, and I'm sure you'll get into this a little more later in terms of actual equipment, but you had talked about various levels of sound here. So if there is, say, an office setting or other type of facility setting and a sound masking system is put in, what type of control or process does a facility management team go through if the space occupancy changes, for instance, and things are reconfigured, and then maybe you need a different level of sound masking for what will be going on in that facility? I don't know if you want to jump into that now, but basically talking about kind of when a system's in, how does that work for the
that's a great question.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I was actually at a big, very sizable company in Hartford, Connecticut, just a couple of weeks ago, going through that same issue where they had one floor in one of their towers that was occupied, but I think at that time full capacity was around 30, maybe 40 people or so. And they brought in a bunch of other people from one of their other buildings, so they'd spiked to well over double of that capacity. In doing so, we had a number of people, kind of raise their hand and ask if any changes need to be made. Usually the answer is no. And I say that because sound masking, what we talked about before, ideally it's going to be extremely uniform. Not only uniform, but consistent. So when I go in and I do a training for an end user for a facilities team, they're usually pretty surprised. But when I say, well, it's more or less a set it and forget it system, it's kind of left in the closet to collect dust. You can make a variety of changes to it, which we usually don't recommend without consulting us first. If changes start to be made in the overall levels or things like that, then again, that makes the system more noticeable. There's a great number of ways, however, to make changes to the system. Most commonly, someone would just log in through the system firmware. If the system's online or on their network, I should say, then changes can be dialed in right through there. You know exactly which zone you're attenuating and what you want to do to it. But these are usually changes that you'd want to consult us for first. There's also a setting on them, and a lot of people don't realize this. Even the ones that have had our sound masking system sometimes installed for years and years, as was actually the case here, there's dip switches also on the back of the controllers. With these dip switches, we're able to actually lower the overall SPL of a given emitter. So instead of affecting an entire zone, we're now able to just affect and reduce the overall sound pressure over one or just a few emitters. This is important if you have someone with, say, a newer digital pair of hearing aids. I do want to call this out, facilities folks, because it's something we've seen a little bit more of late. As the hearing aids tend to go digital, a lot of the frequencies that they're boosting are actually the very frequencies that we are pushing out through our sound masking system. So they're going to most likely have a setting on it which is called oh boy, it's something along the lines of a going out setting, and that does a much better job of helping them out. But if that doesn't help, you can also lower these dip switches on our sound masking emitters. That helps a great deal. So anyways, there's a great number of ways to adjust the systems to accommodate for any changes in capacity. We can do different ramp modes to change for time of day, for example. If you don't want the system running on the weekends, you can basically have the system either get much quieter for the weekends in anticipation of a very minimal skeleton crew or whatnot. We can mute it in the evenings, say if you've got a security guard or someone that comes on site and they need to hear everything that's going on. Cases like that, you could certainly mute the system. So I hope that answers the question, but feel free to chime in if there was anything else. So with that being said, proper zoning, kind of also getting back into what you were just asking about, is these different types of areas, all very different in terms of function, and then of course acoustically speaking as well. So your zone 1 here, and these are theoretical, you could have just about any zone do whatever you want, so long as it is the same type of area. So in this case, I'm using a zone 1 for my open office, 2 for the private offices, and I've got a separate zone 3 from just that smaller reception area. Open office is obviously has a very specific need. You've got people in generally fairly close proximity, and the idea there is to greatly cut down on distractions that they're getting from their coworkers, from them being on the phone next to them or just chatting with each other. Well, like we showed before, we're able to cut it down so one of those employees is only hearing, say, the next 2 or so employees around them. And for that zone, therefore, we'd want a fairly high SPL level. So say that's where we would go with that 47 or so dBA. For my zone 2, which is private offices, since I've already got the added benefit of those walls, right? Often and usually not going up all the way to the deck, but what I'd like to do for those spaces is go anywhere from about 38 to 42 decibels. And that's because we already have the added benefit of having walls there. So people aren't going to be as likely to overhear conversations from one office to the next, right? And there's obviously a larger space there as well. So we can go with a much smaller amount of sound masking in those spaces. The reception area, or my zone 3, is somewhat of an interesting case here. So there's a lot of things that we can take into account when we look at an office space and do a design on this. Most noteworthy, I would say, is remember that picture from way back when, where you had that boardroom or that glass conference room, and it's right next to a reception area. Look familiar? So that conference room, who knows what kind of conversations they're having in there, right? Chances are you usually don't want those conversations flooding out into your zone 1, your zone 2, and certainly not into zone 3, which is your reception area. Remember, anyone can walk in there and overhear these conversations. So because of that, granted, it's going to be a tighter space, a more reflective space. So you're going to find a lot more glass there. Instead of acoustical tile ceilings, you're more likely to find a gypsum ceiling in there. So again, not at all helping us out in terms of speech privacy. So for those reasons, usually what I would do in this particular case is I would probably have the same exact sound level in my zone 3 as I do in my zone 1 to make sure that it's loud enough to cover up those conversations that could be coming from the conference room. Another thing that you'd use these different zones for would be to add paging or music, and being able to adjust those different levels appropriately. So say you want music in zone 3, God forbid, don't do it, but if you wanted to have music playing in the open office areas, then you can adjust that separately as well, so long as it's on its own zone. I threw that out there because I've never had one good experience with employees using background music for an open office area. The most obvious thing will come up, and it's just that people can't agree on the type of music that they like. So anyways, then that last, I think, aspect of an effective sound masking system is going to be uniformity. I alluded to it before, but it's absolutely vital that you have your sound masking be completely uniform. You should not be able to tell any fluctuation in the sound level. As soon as you can tell that something has changed, it's automatically going to draw your attention to it, and that serves as a huge detriment to sound masking. So all systems should be designed with perfect uniformity in mind. If they're not, it's just not going to function as it should. So there's different types of sound masking systems out there. Nice thing with Cambridge Sound is we have every single type of solution. Not only do we have indirect, but we have direct fields. As a matter of fact, we even have residential units now. So we really have all of the different types of solutions available. So the indirect solution was the earliest type of sound masking system, and it was so for a number of reasons. But usually it was because of the technology available at the time. So what in plenum, as they're also known, systems rely on are fairly sizable speakers, right? Like I said before, usually a 6-inch or larger driver, and then it projects this sound, at least for the purposes of sound masking. It's going to be sending that signal back up, and it's going to work on a principle called diffusion, which bounces this sound around in that plenum space. And it has to be tuned very, very specifically so when that sound comes back down to ear level, you're getting that uniformity. You're getting that frequency as well that you want for an effective sound masking system. And then there's a direct field solution, which Cambridge Sound Management pioneered. Idea here is we're taking very 1 1/4-inch drivers and placing them directly above the occupants of the space. And this way, it allows us to do a number of things. But most importantly, what it does is it allows us to get sound masking only where we need it. And it allows for the perfect spectrum and the perfect overall sound pressure levels all the time. So especially if you've got multiple facilities and expect similar, sets of equipment and results in one space to the next, then QT is great for that because it's easily installed and it always guarantees results, and it's always the same. In this case, what you're seeing now is you've got your open office space kind of there in the middle with that darker sort of bluish color, the lighter colored blue or almost gray as some sort of a private office, and then there you have it. Again, it's basically just showing you that you wanted tuned for those types of spaces. With these systems, we are indeed LEED certified, so now they've actually taken into account how sound masking needs to be delivered, what kind of sets of criteria you want to hit. So the speech privacy spectrum is a spectrum that obviously has to be effectively masking conversations. It can't exceed 48 dBA. If it does, again, it's just too loud. And then you want a coverage uniformity of 4 dBA. And we, with QT, we're able to do usually well less than 3 dBA. So it's just a great sounding system. So some design issues that I'd like you to think about when you've got the chance to work on a new build out or you're doing a retrofit. Keep in mind those privacy goals of about 80 to 95%. What are going to have the largest effect on that? And first one right off the bat, which usually is a non-issue because you can't really change it, it's going to be distance. So the physical distance from one talker to the next. Head orientation plays a very important part. So if you're setting up different open office cubes, pay very close attention to how all of those are sitting, how you have the employees facing and what have you. The absorption of your ceiling tiles is vital as well. If you have the ability to go with a higher quality ceiling tile, it'll be one of the better things that you can do next to sound masking, really, that has the most profound effect on acoustical privacy throughout a space. The effectiveness of your barriers. So if you look at this picture, you see kind of a typical little barrier that's more or less almost just there for aesthetics because it's really not going to do much for acoustic privacy. It's by no means really going to block those conversations from traveling from one of those people sitting there on the closer side to us, making its way over to the people on the other end. And then background sound level. Another one of those things. Whether you have a masking system or not, basically the SPL generated by your HVAC system is also going to play an important part. If you've got the ability to make it a constant pressure system, by all means do that. People tend to find an HVAC system that clicks off, clicks on, clicks off extremely annoying. You might have even noticed it in your own space. If you're on the phone and the HVAC system is on, everyone's just talking, going about their workday, and all of a sudden that system clicks off. Well, the space just got a whole lot louder or quieter, depending on how you want to think about it. You're now able to much better hear those conversations. So it's a very similar thing that actually you get with sound masking. Similar but different. We'll get into that in just a little bit. So improving acoustics, although while preserving the aesthetics of your space, there's really a very limited number of ways you can do that. So take your typical office. This will be our default office. There's no sound masking. We've got 48-inch high partitions. We've got a pretty average NRC rated ceiling tile of 0.5, and that nets us an average privacy index rating of 59%. So pretty bad. So let's try improving on this. So we'll add increased absorption. So we'll throw at it a really good quality ceiling tile. We've done so without changing anything else. So we've raised it to a 0.95 rated ceiling tile. You've brought up your average privacy index all the way to 74%. You've done that at whatever the cost is per tile, right? So $2 worth of work, and for a pretty good return. Now you can increase the blocking, and this is my personal favorite because basically you're turning your space into like a corn maze. You're taking your partitions and you're pulling them up all the way to 80 inches, right? Nothing else changes compared to that typical office space. You've brought your privacy index all the way up to 82%, but you've done so and you've sacrificed aesthetics of the space, and yeah, so usually not a solution. Now we're going to take that same office, and the only thing we're going to do is add masking, right? We're actually able to take that privacy index of 59% and boost it all the way to 87%. And we've done so with an active sound masking system. And by active, I just mean that it is the only way that we're actively controlling the sound in the space instead of doing a passive means by adding additional blocking or what have you. We've done so at the lowest cost per square foot and yielded the most effective. So it's extremely effective. So this graph is neat, but at the same time, if you just ask yourself in your space a few questions, then you'll know if you have an application for sound masking. The first question would really be, gee, can I hear over people talking? Yes? Okay. Is that distracting to you? It is? Okay. Or is it safe to say that if you're understanding them, they are understanding you? Okay. And then the last question really would be, are any of those conversations fairly confidential in nature? So should certain people not be overhearing those conversations? And the answer is, at least in some cases, certainly a yes. And there's your case for sound masking. But anyways, healthcare is a huge market for us for obvious reasons. Not only does it help with the privacy of that patient speaking with their doctor, but it also promotes a more full night's rest, allowing patients to recover faster. So there's a lot of benefits for it in that type of an application. For obvious reasons, there's a lot of use of it in secured facilities, government, military installations, things like that, especially SCIFs or secured compounded information facilities. Wow, that did not come out right, but you get what I'm saying. So a lot with government. Courtrooms, we've seen a pretty big peak in courtrooms. So when the judge calls a sidebar up, they're able to hit a button, pull up the sound masking just over the jury so they're not being influenced by that conversation, that question that the judge might be asking from his sidebar. So we're seeing a lot of work there. Education, we do a lot of work in libraries, testing rooms, and the like. Especially now, in many of the universities I've seen, you've got libraries, but on the same note, you've also got these tech centers, which are basically like libraries with books, but you've got a lot of different, very active sort of groups, sometimes using like media technologies, 3D printing, or what have you. So you might even have some of these groups competing on certain projects. So it's great for areas like that where there is some collaboration, but at the same time, you don't want people outside of your direct group overhearing what's being said. Small application, but a really cool one for that. You've got certainly an application in retail. We do quite a bit with car showrooms, actually, or car dealerships, you know, where you've got very open spaces where the car's laid out, and then you've usually got little booths where people go to talk to you about financing or what have you. We do quite a bit of work in houses of worship as well, more so in the counseling offices and those kinds of areas in that type of a space. spas, we have some very good clients, repeat clients that use us for their spas. And call centers is obviously a huge one for us. It is nearly impossible to have an effective space without sound masking. There's been so many cases where I've gone into a client with a large call center, and we had to tune the system right off the bat, which is usually a no-no. You never want to tune the system when it's occupied, but this client's like, you have to turn it on, you have to get it up right now. So I did. And after I set it to where I thought it was appropriate, I actually walked the space. Come to find out, people were just telling us that this is perfect. Do not touch it. Leave it just the way it is. Leave it on. Don't turn it off. Usually what we would do is we would automatically ramp that system up so that it gets progressively louder, 1 decibel every business day. They said, leave it on. It's perfect. So, so some sound masking myths. These are usually fun. HVAC noise is not a substitute for a masking system. It's not tuned, right, to the frequencies found within speech. So although you're going to have a lot of SPL or a lot of sound coming from it, the sound usually is not at all appropriate. Although in certain cases, it's a lot better than not having that sound there. Now it's just a matter of keeping it on all the time. Sound masking does not reduce noise that's already too loud. So although there's certain cases to be made at the restaurants and bars, for certain like smaller dining areas perhaps, it doesn't suck up sound, right? It's not going to make something that's already too loud quieter. It doesn't cancel any kind of sound, all right? So these are not noise canceling headsets. We're not using microphones to pick up the frequencies, spit out the inverse of it, all the while blocking the sound with a physical thing over your ear, blocking that sound. It doesn't absorb other sounds. It does not block sounds. We've had in the past some installs where we were not involved, and what happened was you'd basically have a line of speakers outside of a door, thinking that it would basically block somehow magically, like a curtain of soundproof what have you, and that it would block all of this sound. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. If you can hear the conversation, you need to keep installing the masking where you can still hear it, and while taking into account all the other factors we spoke about before, like uniformity. It doesn't prevent face-to-face communication. You're still going to be able to hear people intelligibly within that 12 or so foot radius, 10 or 12 foot radius. Outside of that, that's when you get all of the benefits of sound masking. It doesn't cause headaches. It's not detrimental to health. Basically, all we are doing with sound masking is replicating the frequencies found within speech. So if someone finds speech annoying, then sound masking probably isn't going to help them a whole heck of a lot with that, so to speak, but it will cut down on what they're overhearing. It doesn't interfere with hearing aids or cochlear implants, usually. Certainly not with cochlear implants. With the newer style of hearing aids, there's different settings on it that you can use to get rid of any interference. And then as I talked about, those dip switches, in every single case where we've adjusted just those dip switches around the speakers surrounding the person with that digital hearing aid, it has helped tremendously. So the benefits of sound masking: increased productivity, 2 to 4% or so. You're going to protect speech privacy and confidential company information. You're certainly going to improve acoustical comfort for employees. So we are a direct descendant of the acousticians who developed sound masking in the first place. So we have the largest team. There's 74 of us at this point in time. When I started, there was just 10 of us, but I'm not going to take you down that path and tell you all about that. But we're constantly engaging with consultants, with partners on how to improve certain systems, what needs to be done. We're always willing to help. So if there's ever any issues in your site, then people go out and actually help you from the company, regardless of where you are, to make sure that you've got an effective install and that everyone's been taken care of. Basically, as I spoke about before, we have an in-house team of acoustical consultants, engineers, and guys that just do designs all day. We have 7 designers right now that do nothing but design the plans that you send in to us. There's actually a page on our website, cambridgesound.com, that lets you fill out a form, send us all the information that we need, and depending on where you are and what kind of an installer you need, we get you turnkeyed pricing back within 3 days usually. So we certainly revolutionized sound masking back in '99 when we came out with the direct field system. Never stop innovating, I guess. We're always coming out with new products. Our systems all do paging, background music, all from a single speaker. Nice thing with that is if you're exploring multiple sets of equipment to do your paging or your sound masking or what have you, we can really bundle that into just one very effective system. The systems have network capability for yourselves. If you want to make any changes to it, you want to customize certain things. And we certainly integrate with other systems very well as well, whether it be a fire and security system. We can take those signals from that. We can cut the masking once an alarm like that has been triggered. If there's messages or broadcasting going out, we can actually amplify those and use our systems to make that more intelligible. We're in at least 40% of the Fortune 100. We came out with these slides last year, so I'm pretty sure that number's gone up quite a bit since then. We're growing by leaps and bounds. Sound masking has really just become something that's a necessary thing to have in today's workspaces. So we're growing a lot. So what we've learned: absorption, blocking, and coverage should equate to a certain level of speech privacy. Feel free to get us those questions if there was something that you've been holding back. Now's going to be the time to let us know. And thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yes. Sorry to jump in there on you, Balazs, but yes, we do have some questions that have come in, and we will I just want to let the audience know we'll spend maybe up to 10 minutes. We're at the 3 o'clock hour, so we don't want to keep anyone, but we did have a lot of good questions, so we do want to spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes certainly addressing those. And I do want to let anyone know if we don't get to your question, Balazs will receive those and can certainly address them directly with you, so please know that. So yes, Balazs, we'll jump right in. We have a few different areas to tackle here. Someone did ask, what additional challenges, if any, are caused by open, the exposed deck ceilings in spaces?
Great question.
Yeah, many offices are not using tiled ceilings today, as I'm sure you know.
Absolutely, wonderful question. To accommodate for this trend, and you know what's interesting is that really this trend has been, when I started about 6 years ago at Cambridge, acoustical ceiling tiles were the norm. Open ceilings were very small in that equation, maybe 15 to 20% or so, but probably not as high as 20% of ceilings were open. Over the last few years, that number has grown so significantly, whether it's just the architecture of the space that people like so much, or just leaving the building like it was before, what have you. We have a lot of different solutions for open ceilings, some of which we basically just launched. So different pendant mounts. We have pendant mounts that would mount right to an electrical back box and allow you to hang our speakers down. We have universal brackets. We have beam brackets to do much of the same if you've got beams that you can utilize. The added, I guess, level of complexity with that really is all just going to come down to installation. So it depends on how high those ceilings are. I mean, we've seen a lot of installs with, nearly 30-foot high ceilings, in which case oftentimes they're going to need basically like a cherry picker to install the product. So in terms of an effective system, we've got the right solutions to mount the product. It just comes down to finding the right installer to actually install it for you. And the nice thing about working with us is we have a huge database of certified installers, not only domestically but internationally, to do that for you.
Thank you. And I'm going to quickly jump back to something that was discussed in the question during the presentation about the different changes that could be made or should maybe be made as space configurations change. But you had actually touched on consulting with the sound masking provider, or that there was certain control mechanisms. So one of the questions that had come in on that vein was, can this type of sound masking system be controlled via a control system? And I'm thinking that might be a building management system, for instance, going to be integrated with existing technology in a building.
That's really more of a Gen 2 product, so something that really truly lives online and can be accessed and a part of a building infrastructure system, management system. Right now, the systems are standalone. Both of our QT Pro and our Dynasound Pro lines have the function to be online or on your system networks where you can log in and make certain changes, but they are standalone pieces of software in the case of Dynasound, and actually firmware in the case of that QT Direct Pro line. So you would actually have to have that system on the network to be able to access it. But through those systems, you can make a variety of changes. As of this moment, we do not have it tied to a larger set of software that you could access it through, though. That's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. And then this is something you touched on earlier as well, as far as the capabilities. And this approaches it from, would sound masking operate on an existing PA system in a facility? And I think you had mentioned some PA or music capabilities. So would this operate on an existing system, or how would that work?
Usually not. So a PA system differs greatly from a masking system, and because a masking system would make a great PA system, the PA system not so much a masking system. Reason for that is with a public address system, you've usually got, again, those strong speakers. A lot of times they're bullhorn speakers. So you're not at all going to get the type of spatial uniformity as you'd want out of a masking system. So although it's sufficient to have, one person's ear get 110 dBA of a PA announcement, a person at the far end of the space, get it at about 80, and that's okay there. I mean, unless you're that guy sitting right next to the speaker. But therefore, it's not going to make an effective sound masking system because it's not at all going to have the uniformity of those sound levels. And there's just no way to tune something like that, make it effective. Whereas a sound masking system is already installed overhead and a perfectly uniform type of a grid pattern usually. It's able to not only provide a great sound masking signal to your ears, but it's able to also send a very, very clear page, a uniform page or music to occupants as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And then this is a question about occupant response, or maybe results, I should say. And maybe there's some examples here, but how have your clients responded to sound masking systems installed in a space that's already occupied? So installing it into an existing space. Do you find acceptance of the systems are better received when installed prior to a space being occupied in a new space? Is there any kind of commentary you have there in terms of new versus existing space?
Sure.
Tips?
Sure. Another really good question. So thanks for all these great questions. There's certain things that we can do to make the sound masking much more happily accepted by the occupants of said space. One of those ways is going to be by creating a commissioning ramp. Now, this is vital, and it's all too often overlooked. So if you're installing a sound masking system, the last thing you want to do is have employees walk into the space come Monday morning. These could be employees that have been there for, decades in certain cases, and they know every nook and cranny of this space. They know every little sound. If there's a deviation from that, they'll pick up on it immediately. And if they walk into work on Monday and it sounds like there's, a flock or whatever of killer bees flying around in their ceilings, they usually won't be very happy with it. So to accommodate for that, what we do is this commissioning ramp. You basically take up, you tune the system so it's at that level that it's going to be when it's finally commissioned, but you get up to that level on a single decibel during the course of a business day. So it usually takes about 2 weeks to get to that final level. That'll help greatly with the acceptance of the system. In the case where our installers are using that, then it's 99.9% extremely well accepted. Not so much so if the system's just turned on and people are kind of left to deal with it. There is an improvement, though, to get back to your question, that can be had for installing the sound masking system before the space is occupied. So with the sound masking system already there and waiting for these new employees, it's just a part of the space. This is a new space to them. It's not a space that anyone is familiar with, so it is simply the way that the space sounds. So if you're able to do it in a new build out prior to occupancy, that's all the better. However, we're able to mitigate any of the negative effects of having it installed after the fact by using these commissioning ramps.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think we'll wrap it up now. And I do want to let everyone know, if we haven't gotten to your question, Balazs will receive that and address you directly. So Balazs, I do want to ask this last question and wrap it up with a kind of an overview of what is, and I know you did touch on this, but what is the difference between sound masking and white noise? What kind of is the different function and features that our audience should take away?
Sure. White noise is almost like the Kleenex brand, right? You don't ask for a tissue, you ask for a Kleenex. I think when people say and think of white noise, they just automatically assume that it's sound masking. So they just make that comparison right off the bat. If you're able to hear pure white noise, it's simply an obnoxious noise. Sound masking has taken years and years of research to come up with an ideal set of frequencies. These ideal set of frequencies, when they're pushed into the space, not only does it sound very pleasant, very much like the whooshing sound you'd get from, a fan, the kind of a flow of air sound, but because we have these frequencies inside of this sound masking signal, it's extremely effective. So nothing like white noise, although you're free to use the term white noise to refer to sound masking because everyone else does. So why not?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to thank you, Balazs, for the presentation. It's a lot of chock full of good information. So thanks for your time today.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Yes, I do want to thank our audience, of course, for attending and for sending in those great questions, and to Cambridge Sound Management for sponsoring the webinar. And we will let you know that a recording of the presentation will be available online at facilityexecutive.com. You'll also be receiving an email from the Cambridge team with a direct link to the recording, so keep an eye out for that as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.